Hey everyone, and welcome to The Black Door. If you're a fan of spine-chilling true stories that will keep you up at night, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a terrifying tale. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's dive into today's horror stories. This is a creepy experience I went through a few years back, shortly after I settled into an old apartment. I'm still in the same town now, and whenever I pass that building, it sends shivers down my spine. I was 27 at the time, already living independently for a while. The place I rented was a modest apartment on the 4th floor of a 5-story building. The wooden floors were old and uneven, making creaky noises with nearly every step. Despite its flaws, it was a step up for me, better than the shared house where I used to split a cramped room with a guy I barely knew. I'd even spent months couch surfing with friends before, so having a space of my own, no matter how tiny, felt like a huge upgrade. When I first moved in, the building seemed eerily empty. I didn't see anyone around. But I figured most people were likely at work since it was the middle of a weekday. After unpacking the essentials, I collapsed on the living room floor, my only comfort being the air mattress I'd picked up at Walmart because I couldn't afford a bed yet. Sometime in the early hours, I was startled awake by a loud, insistent knock at my door. Groggily, I checked my phone. It was 5 a.m. Annoyed, I dragged myself to the door, thinking it might be important, maybe even the landlord. Peeking through the peephole, I saw a man who looked to be in his 40s standing stiffly. His expression was blank, almost unnerving. Assuming he might be the building superintendent or staff, I reluctantly opened the door. He introduced himself as my next-door neighbor, said his name was Jake. I tried to stay polite, though his timing made me bristle. He didn't explain why he'd woken me so early, but instead lingered, asking a few generic questions like where I worked and how I liked the building. At one point, he awkwardly mentioned the weather. I didn't want to be rude, but the whole interaction felt off, and he didn't seem to get my hints to wrap things up. Finally, I mumbled something about needing sleep and shut the door mid-sentence while he was still talking. I managed to fall back asleep for a couple more hours before starting my day. That evening, after running errands and grabbing dinner with a friend, I returned to the apartment around 6 p.m. As I climbed the stairs to my floor, my heart sank when I saw Jake standing just a few feet from my door. His posture was stiff again, and he didn't appear to be doing any just standing there. When he noticed me approaching, he quickly turned and disappeared into his apartment without a word. The encounter left me unsettled. His strange behavior from earlier was bad enough, but now it felt like he was keeping tabs on me. Over the next few days, I met a couple of the other tenants, including a guy named Alex who seemed normal. He was around my age and said he'd been living there for 2 years. I brought up Jake with Alex the next time we talked, asking if he knew much about him. Alex shrugged, saying Jake was odd but didn't seem dangerous. That made me feel a bit more at ease. Maybe I was overthinking the whole thing. By then, I'd managed to get my place fully set up. I'd upgraded to a queen bed, bought a small couch, and even added a table in the corner of the room. The apartment finally felt like somewhere I could actually live. One night that week, I went to bed around midnight. The day had been normal, so I had no reason to think anything weird would happen. But in the middle of the night, a loud knock on my door jolted me awake. Groggily, I looked at my phone. It was 3:15 a.m. My stomach dropped. Who else could it be but Jake? I shuffled to the door and peeked through the peephole. Sure enough, he was there, standing stiffly in front of my door like before. "Not right now, Jake," I called through the door, trying to sound firm. A part of me wanted to call the cops, but Alex's words stuck in my head. Maybe Jake just wasn't good with people. Maybe this was some misguided attempt to connect. Still, I couldn't ignore how uneasy he made me feel. He didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there for a few seconds and then started knocking again, harder and faster this time. He wasn't stopping. I stood and frozen, unsure what to do. My mind raced. What if he kept this up all night? But if I called the police, would I regret it? Against all better judgment, I cracked the door open, hoping to reason with him. As soon as the latch clicked, he slammed into it. The edge of the door hit my forehead, making me stumble backward. My heart was pounding as I managed to shove him out into the hallway. The door was still slightly ajar, and his arm was wedged in. That's when I saw a glint of metal in his hand. My blood ran cold. He had a knife. Panic took over, and I slammed against the door with everything I had. After a few hard hits, the knife clattered to the ground, and he yanked his arm back. The second the door was closed, I locked it and called the police. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. The cops showed up fast, and Jake didn't resist when they arrested him. I watched from the peephole as they led him away in handcuffs. Later, I found out he was evicted from the building. I never saw him again. Even with Jake gone, I couldn't shake the fear that had taken hold of me. I didn't feel safe in that apartment anymore, not even during the day. Within a few weeks, I started searching for a new place. Thankfully, my landlord understood and let me break the lease. The relief I felt when I handed in my keys and walked out for the last time was unlike anything I'd felt before. Back when I was about 20, I was still staying at home with my mom and her second husband. Even though I had a steady job, I stuck around to save up some cash. My stepdad, on the other hand, wanted me gone as soon as he thought I could manage on my own. We weren't exactly on good terms lately, which I'm pretty sure played into his push to get me out. They gave me a few months to figure things out, so I started checking rental listings online almost daily. Eventually, I landed a tiny apartment that fit my budget. It was on the second floor of this old rundown building that had 4 floors in total, no elevator, just these narrow wooden stairs that creaked with every step. The apartment wasn't much, just a cramped kitchen, a small living room, and a bedroom barely big enough for a bed. It didn't bother me, but the area. Let's just say it wasn't the best part of the city. I didn't know the neighborhood that well despite living nearby growing up, but its bad reputation wasn't a secret. Crimes from around there were regulars on the evening news. My mom helped me move in, bringing over some of my things from home, and then it was just me. On my first night, I had some friends over to celebrate. I was the first of our group to move out, so I felt like I'd hit some big milestone. Since I didn't have furniture yet, we sat on the living room's hard floor, talking and laughing. At one point, we heard shouting from next door, loud enough to cut through the music we had playing. I remember thinking how annoying it would be if that noise became a regular thing. A few days later, I met the neighbor responsible for all the yelling. His name was Dave, probably in his late 40s, and he looked pretty rough. His smile revealed several missing teeth, and one of his eyes was always half closed, like he was squinting. He had this vibe that made him seem like he was barely holding things together. Though I knew he wasn't homeless, he lived with a girlfriend named Maria, though I hadn't run into her yet. Through the paper-thin walls, I'd already overheard their screaming matches a few times. It wasn't just arguing, it was the kind of yelling that makes your skin crawl. I made a mental note to steer clear of them. Eventually, I bumped into Maria, and she was way younger than Dave. If I had to guess, she was probably around 30. She had a lot of tattoos, short black hair, and was on the heavier side. We didn't talk much, just quick hello and polite small talk when we crossed paths. Despite trying to keep my distance, the fights between them didn't stop. If anything, they seemed to get worse. Though it never seemed physical, no sounds of breaking furniture, no crashes, just constant screaming and slammed doors. But then, one day, it all went quiet. It took me a while to notice Maria wasn't around anymore. I didn't hear her voice through the walls or see her outside the building. My first thought was that they broke up and she left, which honestly made sense given how volatile they were. I wasn't particularly worried. Their relationship seemed doomed from the start. About a month went by without a sound from Dave's place. Honestly, it was a relief. The peace and quiet felt strange, but in a good way. For the first time since moving in, I could actually enjoy being in my own space without dreading the noise. But one night, the silence broke. I heard yelling again, but it wasn't like before. The voice wasn't Maria's. Of that, I was certain. It sounded like Dave was arguing with someone new. I didn't want to snoop, but the paper-thin walls left me no choice. The shouting grew louder, followed by a door slamming open. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Against my better judgment, I got up to check what was happening. Through the peephole, I saw a young woman storming out. She looked upset, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen like she'd been crying hard. She hurried down the stairs and disappeared before I could get a better look. Her footsteps echoed until they faded completely. Something about it left me uneasy, but I told myself it was probably just another messy breakup. Still, I couldn't shake the bad feeling Dave always gave me. Later that night, just when I was starting to settle down, a loud knock startled me. When I opened the door, 2 police officers stood there. They asked if I knew Dave and if I had noticed anything strange earlier. My heart sank when they mentioned the woman from before. Apparently, she'd reported Dave for something serious, something criminal. I told them what little I knew, mostly that I'd seen her leave in a hurry and looking upset. They thanked me and headed next door. A little while later, I watched through the peephole as they escorted Dave out in handcuffs. His expression was calm, almost blank, which made it even creepier. He didn't struggle, didn't argue, just walked with them like it was nothing. After that, everything went quiet again, but this time, the quiet felt heavy, like the air in the building had changed. A few days later, while grabbing my mail, I bumped into the building manager. He looked frustrated, muttering about the trouble Dave had caused for the property. When I pressed for details, he hesitated, only saying the police were investigating serious claims against him. It wasn't long before someone else moved into that apartment. Dave never came back. Eventually, I found out from the news that Dave had been charged with assaulting the woman I saw that night. Hearing that made my mind wander back to Maria. What had really been going on in that apartment before she disappeared? I never heard anything that sounded like violence, but now I wondered if I just missed it. It's haunted me ever since. Could I have done more? Should I have? But it's too late to change anything now. What's done is done, and all I can do is live with the questions. I grew up in a pretty typical suburban neighborhood, the kind with rows of identical houses and manicured lawns. Just down the block from my family's place was a rundown apartment complex. The people living there didn't stick around for long, so there were always new faces. A couple of my close friends lived there, so I ended up hanging out at the complex a lot. That summer, a new family moved into one of the units. They had a son named Nick who was around my age, and it turned out we'd be in the same grade when school started. Nick was different from the other kids I knew. At first, I thought he was just quirky in an interesting way. We clicked quickly, spending the summer together doing typical kid stuff. Nick always kept things exciting. He was the kind of guy who could turn even a boring afternoon into an adventure. But Nick's idea of fun was sometimes off. There was this one day when a group of us was hanging out at his place, Nick, my brother Eli, and another kid, Chris. Nick's mom wasn't home, so we had the place to ourselves. We were sitting in the living room watching cartoons when, out of nowhere, Nick leaned over to Chris and said, "Dead serious? I could kill you right now if I wanted to." Everyone went silent. Then we all sort of laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the chill it gave me. Nick didn't laugh with us. He just stared at Chris like he was waiting for a reaction. Things only got weirder. A few weeks later, we were walking through the woods behind my house, cutting through to get to the playground. Nick had this water bottle with him, but when he opened it, the smell hit us gasoline. He said he wanted to see what would happen if we lit a fire. We all told him it was a bad idea, and eventually he gave up on it. But later, he swore he'd only been joking. I didn't buy it. That smell was real, and it lingered in the air like a warning. When school started that September, I found out I had a bunch of classes with my usual group, including Nick. We were still spending time with him then, but honestly, I was starting to get uneasy. During the first week, Nick got into a fight with another guy from our class. This kid wasn't one of my closest friends, but he was well liked by most people. I never found out what sparked it, but my gut told me Nick was the one who started it. Another time, Nick was goofing off in class, and the teacher told him to knock it off. Instead of sitting back down, Nick stood up, walked right up to the teacher, and stared him down like he was daring him to do something. He didn't throw any punches, but the air in the room felt thick, like something awful might happen. After that, there were other smaller incidents, and the whole thing just made me and my friends decide to start pulling away. We stopped sitting with him at lunch and made excuses not to include him when we were hanging out. One night, I was walking home after spending a couple of hours at Chris's place in the apartments. On the way back, I spotted Nick. He didn't say a word, just stood there watching me with this glare that felt like it could burn a hole through my chest. I hurried home and locked the door behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen. That night, I woke up to a loud crash coming from downstairs. It was the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. My dad rushed down thinking it might be a break-in, but when he got to the front hall, all he found was a rock lying on the floor next to a busted window. He searched the house while my mom called the police, but there was no sign of anyone. Deep down, I knew it had to be Nick. Who else would do something like that? But I had no proof, so we didn't confront his mom about it. The next day at school, though, Nick made sure I knew it was him. He was talking to a group of kids, bragging about how he'd thrown the rock and saying he'd do worse next time. He even said he was going to kill me and my family. That was enough to get the cops involved. They gave him a warning, telling him there'd be serious consequences if he didn't back off. I thought he should have faced some consequences right then and there, but I guess the rules for kids are different. After that, Nick kept his distance for a while. A few months later, his family packed up and left town. I never learned why they moved, but I wasn't complaining. Maybe it was because he'd done enough to get expelled, or maybe his mom just wanted a fresh start. Part of me hopes he ended up in some kind of program that could actually help him, but I doubt it. All I know is that Nick is just a memory no one I'm more than happy to leave in the past. It was the summer of 2018, and I had just married my high school sweetheart. We settled into a cozy duplex in a nice part of town. Things were looking up. A few months later, I discovered I was pregnant. My husband and I were overjoyed, and our families couldn't have been happier. This detail is crucial. My parents lived in a unit a block down from ours, while my grandparents stayed in the house right between. We all loved being close to each other, so it just made sense to live nearby. My husband spent weekends at a local fishing derby the town held. It ran late into the night, so I usually stayed home since I was constantly nauseous and couldn't stand the fishy smell. Evenings were my quiet time to unwind, often spent sitting outside with my mom and grandparents. That's when things began to feel off. One of our neighbors started acting really weird. He lived in the last house at the edge of the complex. Our mailboxes weren't attached to the houses. Instead, they were at the complex entrance. He would pull up his car just to sit there, facing our direction every single evening after grabbing his mail. He wouldn't leave. He'd just stay in his car, parked, staring in our direction for what felt like forever, sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes over an hour. It was the way his eyes locked on us, especially mine, that made my skin crawl. His face was blank, like he wasn't even there. This became a regular thing. My family noticed too, and we began keeping an eye on him. We'd warn each other to stay alert, but the unease wouldn't go away. One night, I decided to break my routine and join my husband and dad at the derby. The trip didn't last long though. My nausea hit hard, forcing me to head home early. My husband agreed I should rest and said he'd wait for me to feel better, but I never made it back. Instead, I tried to distract myself with some movies and waited until it was time to pick him up since I had dropped him off earlier. On the drive back, something strange happened. We stopped at a red light when a car came speeding up behind us, closing in fast. I told my husband to look, and he saw it too. This car was practically glued to our bumper. My chest tightened as the light turned green, and I hit the gas. But when I glanced in the mirror, the car just sat there, unmoving. I nudged my husband to check, and just as I said it, the car shifted forward, its headlights suddenly flicking off. By now, it was past 2 a.m., and the empty streets made everything feel eerie. "Oh my God, look at that," I whispered sharply. "Yeah, I see it. Just focus on driving, okay?" he muttered, trying to keep me calm. I glanced in the mirror again and saw the headlights flash back on. The car sped up. its high beams glaring into my truck, only for the lights to cut out again. As it got closer, my grip on the wheel tightened as my pulse quickened. My husband stayed quiet, but I could tell he wasn't calm either. When we finally reached our townhouse complex, I pulled in, hoping the car would keep driving. But it didn't. Instead, it followed, headlights back on, trailing close behind. I pulled into our parking spot, heart pounding, while the car lingered near the entrance. My husband and I exchanged a panicked glance. "Let's not get out yet," he said softly, scanning the lot. The car inched forward, rolling slowly down the street, and that's when we got a good look at it. My stomach dropped. It was our creepy neighbor. I couldn't mistake that beat-up sedan for anything else. He parked just a few spots away, climbed out, and stood on his porch, glaring straight at us. He stayed there, unmoving, just staring at our truck like he was daring us to get out. For what felt like forever, probably just 2 or 3 minutes, he didn't budge. Then, without a word, he turned and went inside. My husband let out a long breath. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. "Who does that?" He shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, but we're steering clear of him from now on." We headed inside, locking every door behind us. The air felt heavy with unease. I tried to shake it off, but the next time he scared me was even worse. I was out running errands alone this time and stopped at a red light. When I glanced in my rearview mirror, my heart froze. There he was, right behind me. His car, so close, it looked like he might rear-end me. His face, though, that's what truly unnerved me. His head was tilted down, but his eyes were locked on me. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his expression cold and twisted. It was like he was daring me to look back, feeding off my fear. When the light turned green, I hit the gas, desperate to put distance between us, but he sped up too, staying right on my bumper. My thoughts raced. What if he crashes into me? What if he hurts me or my baby? At 6 months pregnant, the thought made my stomach churn. His car loomed behind me, that same unsettling glare still on his face. I didn't know what else to do, so I tried to throw him off. I flipped on my left turn signal but quickly veered right, pulling off the road at the last second. The move nearly caused him to hit me, and I swerved to avoid a collision. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and called my husband. "He's following me," I blurted, my voice cracking. He almost hit me this time. By the time I got home, my hands were still trembling. I turned into the complex, and of course, there he was, standing by the mailbox, casually rifling through his mail like nothing in the world was wrong. I parked and immediately called my mom. "Can you come down here? I need to talk to you," I said, my voice shaky as I recounted what had just happened. She was at my passenger door in minutes. As she approached, I noticed him slowly pulling his car down the road, and as he passed us, he didn't even try to hide either. His eyes were locked on me, that same blank, unsettling stare. I bolted out of the truck and into the house, double-checking every lock and latch. My mom stood on the porch, shaking her head. "I can't believe anyone would act like that," she muttered. But the worst was yet to come. My sister, who never lets anything slide, decided to dig deeper into this guy's past. She's basically a detective in our family, always needing to know everything. A few days later, she came back with news that made my stomach churn. He was a convicted murderer. He'd killed his girlfriend and lived with her body for days before he was caught trying to dispose of it. He'd claimed insanity, but it didn't stick. Though somehow he still managed to get out of prison way too early. After learning that, I couldn't shake the unease. Paranoia became my constant companion. I locked every door, every window, every single night, triple-checking before I could even think about sleeping. I started carrying a gun with me everywhere legally, of course, but still, it wasn't something I ever thought I'd need to do. I felt like I was living in someone else's nightmare, not my own life. Months passed. My husband and dad were outside working on the truck one evening, while my mom, my newborn, and I sat on the porch, trying to relax. It had been a while since we'd seen him, and for a moment, I thought maybe things were finally going back to normal. But then I heard Idakar coming into the complex blasting, "I've had the time of my life" from Dirty Dancing. My stomach turned as his car slowly rolled down the road, creeping by us. As usual, he was staring, My mom and I sat frozen, watching him pull into his usual spot, but instead of parking, he reversed, lining his car up perfectly so he could sit there and keep watching us. The music was still blaring, making the whole thing even more surreal and unsettling. I whispered to my mom, "Get Dad and my husband now. They came up fast, and when we told them what was happening, they'd had enough. Stay here." My dad growled, and they started walking straight toward the guy's car. He must have seen them coming because, without hesitation, he gunned it, peeling out of the lot and speeding off down the alley. To this day, I can't listen to that song without feeling sick to my stomach. He ruined it for me completely. I hope I never hear it again. Thankfully, he moved out not long after that, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. My house finally felt like a safe place again. Every now and then, though, I'll see him around town. When I do, all the old fear comes rushing back like it never left. He's still the same creep with the same empty, unnerving stare, and no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget how afraid he made me feel. When I was around 27, my days were mostly consumed by work, and I lived in a small historic village in the Midwest. Life didn't offer much excitement, so when my older cousin, she was in her late 30s, came to visit from Little Rock, I was thrilled. She wanted to check out the nightlife on her first evening in town, which was rare for me, so I eagerly agreed. She liked her drinks, so we decided to explore the handful of local bars my town had to offer. We found a single spot that seemed lively. It had a pool table and allowed smoking indoors, which sold it for us. My cousin quickly wandered off to play pool with some guys while I stayed at the bar, sipping my drink and scrolling through my phone. Not long after, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Turning around, I saw an older man, and for a second, I didn't recognize him. Seeing my confusion, he smiled and said, "Hey, it's me, Jacob's dad." That's when it clicked. He was the father of Jacob, a guy I had briefly dated in middle school when I was maybe 15. Jacob's dad had always seemed strict back then. I even remembered him making his son dig trenches in the yard as punishment, regardless of the weather, whenever I'd been at their house. Something about him had always made me uneasy, though I could never pinpoint why. Still, it surprised me that he remembered me at all after so many years. He offered to buy me a drink, and I figured it couldn't hurt to chat for a bit. We talked casually, catching up. At one point, my cousin came over to check on me, her eyebrows raising slightly when she saw I was talking to someone significantly older. After some time, the man suggested we step outside to get away from the thick cigarette smoke inside. Thinking nothing of it, I agreed and followed him out. The chill outside air hit me, and I realized it was just the two of us. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. He was someone I had known years ago after all. But as we stood there, the tone shifted. He started asking me personal questions if I had a boyfriend or if I'd ever considered dating someone older. That uneasy feeling I remembered from his house years ago began creeping back. I quickly suggested we head back inside where it was warmer. But again, after only a few minutes, he insisted we step outside once more. By then, I was already trying to dodge his requests without causing a scene. My cousin caught on to the vibe and glanced over from her pool game, her expression making it clear she was keeping an eye on things. I tried to focus on anything else, but he wouldn't give up. This time, he brought up his truck, suggesting we go check it out for some vague reason. When I politely declined for what felt like the 10th time, his demeanor shifted. Out of nowhere, he grabbed my arm and started tugging me toward the door. Panic flared up, but before I could react, my cousin appeared as if summoned. She grabbed my other arm and yanked me back while yelling, "Back off, creep!" Her voice was loud enough to draw attention, and he immediately let go, muttering something before slipping into the crowd and disappearing out the back exit. After that, we shook it off and decided to enjoy the rest of the night. We laughed, danced, and had the kind of carefree fun I hadn't had in ages. But the weirdness of that encounter lingered in my mind. About 6 months later, I found out just how much worse things could have been. A neighbor told me he'd been arrested and was in prison probably for good this time. The story that followed was horrifying. Apparently, he had been stalking his ex-wife for months after their separation. One night, he broke into her house, tied her up and forced her into the back of his truck. His plan, as terrifying as it sounds, was to drive her to Mexico to kill her. Along the way, they stopped for a night in Los Angeles, where things got even darker. Throughout the night, he reportedly beat and tortured her, telling her she wouldn't make it out alive. The abuse had been going on for years, and this was his final twisted attempt at control. But somehow, she managed to escape. Whether it was sheer luck or incredible courage, she got away and alerted the authorities. They arrested him shortly after, ending his reign of terror. Hearing this made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the thought of how close I'd come to being in a similar situation. Looking back, those uneasy feelings I had as a kid suddenly made perfect sense. He was a monster, plain and simple.